He didn't know why the memory still returned to him in flashes, like headlights cutting violently through darkness. But Paul Walker always said there were moments in life that felt less like chapters and more like warnings whispered by fate. And long before the world knew him as the calm-faced undercover cop who drifted between loyalty and adrenaline on the screen, he had lived through a night that felt ripped straight out of a movie he hadn't acted in yet. A night that would later shape the man he became, the character he embodied, and the quiet fears he never spoke aloud. It happened years before the first engine roar echoed in theaters, back when Paul was still learning who he was, and Hollywood had not yet molded him into a symbol of speed. What he found on that night wasn't fame, and it wasn't action. It was a man who should not have existed. Someone who looked like a ghost made of gasoline fumes and asphalt dust. Someone people whispered about but never claimed to know. The street racer who, without realizing it, would become the blueprint of Brian O'Connor. Paul hadn't planned on meeting him. He never planned anything reckless. He wasn't built that way. But curiosity can be as dangerous as any supercharged engine. And when the stories began circulating through friends of friends about an illegal racer who drove as if he had nothing left to lose, Paul felt something stir inside him. Not excitement, not fear. Something quieter, deeper, almost gravitational. People spoke of this man like a myth wandering through the city streets. Someone who broke records, broke rules, and almost broke himself as he drifted through a world that chewed up men like him and spat out their names in smoke. They called him Vex. No one knew if that was a nickname or a warning. The night Paul first saw him, the city felt wrong, wrapped in a humidity that clung to the skin and made every breath feel heavier. Neon lights bled into puddles, lining the cracked pavement, and engines throbbed like restless hearts waiting to be unleashed. Paul stood beneath an overpass, the air so thick with exhaust that it tasted metallic on his tongue. He didn't blend in. He wasn't trying to. He looked like someone visiting another world, someone who didn't yet understand that every person present had already chosen which part of themselves they were willing to lose to the night. Vex emerged out of a cluster of shadows, thin but carved from tension, with eyes that looked past everything except the road. A man who lived as if the next race might be his last, but he welcomed that possibility like an old friend. People stepped aside for him without being asked. Paul watched him move and felt something shift inside, a strange recognition, as if he was watching a future ghost of a character he hadn't been offered yet, a role that would one day define him. But that night, none of that mattered. All Paul knew was that something about Vex pulled him in like a gravitational field. And when their eyes met for the first time, Vex didn't smile, didn't nod, didn't acknowledge the attention. He simply said, "You don't belong here." The words hit harder than they should have, maybe because they were true, but Paul didn't walk away. He stepped closer instead, staring at the matte black car behind Vex, a machine that looked alive, like a beast waiting to be fed asphalt. He didn't understand why he wanted to ride in it, or why the idea of being near this stranger made his pulse slow down instead of spike. Fate doesn't shout. It whispers, quietly enough that you only hear it if your life is already bending toward it. In the middle of their silence, Paul felt something unusual rise within him, a need to ask the viewers something as if this story still echoed into the present. If you were standing there, surrounded by engines and danger, would you take that step too? And where are you watching this from right now, in this moment where the past and present blend through the screen? Paul didn't wait for permission. He said he wanted to ride with him. Vex stared at him for a long moment, gauging whether he was another thrill-seeker chasing adrenaline, or a man searching for something he couldn't name. Then Vex unlocked the passenger door without breaking eye contact. "Get in," he said. "If you're going to see this world, see it for what it really is. Not the stories, not the glamour, the truth." Inside the car, the air felt unnaturally still, as if the world held its breath for what was about to happen. Paul gripped the seatbelt, and Vex laughed. "If you're scared, you shouldn't be here." But Paul wasn't scared. Not exactly. He felt something else entirely, the strange calm that comes before a life-altering moment, the stillness of someone realizing their path was shifting beneath their feet. When Vex started the engine, the vibrations traveled through Paul's spine like a warning, and the street around them blurred into streaks of cold neon. The ride that followed wasn't racing, as Paul understood it. It wasn't about speed, it was about surrender. Vex drove like the world couldn't touch him, weaving through the city with a precision that looked impossible. Each turn a confession, each acceleration a memory he refused to say aloud. The city wailed around them, horns and distant sirens forming a symphony of controlled chaos. And Paul felt himself absorbing everything. The way Vex breathed, the way he shifted gears like a man conducting a ritual, the way his eyes reflected not thrill, but pain. This was the man he would later portray without even realizing it. This was the heartbeat behind the character who would make him a legend. By the time the car skidded to a halt in an abandoned lot, Paul's hands were trembling, not from fear, but from the realization that something inside him had awakened. Vex didn't look at him right away. He simply stepped out of the car and leaned against the hood, staring up at the sky as if trying to read something written only for him. When Paul joined him, Vex finally said, "You don't drive to escape. You drive because it's the only place where the truth doesn't hurt." Paul didn't answer. He didn't have to. In that moment, he understood why he had been pulled into this world, why he had felt that strange force guiding him. This wasn't about racing. It was about identity, about losing yourself just enough to understand who you really are. And as the night wrapped itself around them like a secret, Paul realized this stranger would shape not only his understanding of speed, but his understanding of himself. A connection formed in silence, a kind of unspoken mentorship between two men standing on opposite sides of destiny. Before the memory fades into the next chapter, let me ask you something. If stories like this move you, if these forgotten moments and hidden truths deserve to be told, then consider subscribing so we can keep exploring the shadows behind the faces you thought you knew. In the weeks that followed that first ride, Paul found it hard to focus on anything else. The movie scripts, the meetings, even the casual smiles from agents and producers, all of it felt shallow, like static noise compared to the silence that lived in the roar of that engine. He kept seeing flashes of that night, the dark road bending like a living creature, the blurred lights reflected in Vex's cold eyes, the feeling of time stretching until nothing existed except movement and instinct. It haunted him, but not like a nightmare. It was something heavier, a kind of longing for a truth he had glimpsed only once and wasn't sure he could ever return to. He didn't tell anyone about it. He couldn't. Hollywood had a way of sterilizing stories, sanding off the edges until they fit neatly into interviews and sound bites. How could he explain that one ride with a stranger had changed him more than any role, any director, any applause? How could he admit that every time he stepped in front of a camera, part of him was pretending to be the man he met that night? The real one, the one who lived outside the boundaries of comfort, whose life burned brighter and shorter than most could handle. But Paul wasn't just fascinated by Vex. He was drawn to the fragility behind the bravado. In the underground world of street racing, respect wasn't earned with fame, it was earned with scars. And Vex wore his like invisible ink, carved deep inside, rather than on his skin. He didn't talk much about himself, but when he did, it came out like fragments of confession. He'd been a mechanic once, before life decided that survival was a full-time job. He'd loved once. Before the city took her away in a crash he never stopped replaying in his head. Now he raced because, in the motion, he could forget. Speed wasn't his addiction, it was his anesthesia. Paul listened, though Vex never seemed to care who he was. Fame meant nothing here. Money meant even less. What mattered was authenticity, a word Paul was still learning the weight of. He began spending more time in the shadowed corners of that world, watching how racers prepared, how they lived on adrenaline and borrowed time, how they talked to their cars like partners, not machines. He realized that what Hollywood portrayed as thrilling chaos was, to them, a a kind of discipline, a philosophy born out of desperation and pride. Every race was a confession, every crash was a prayer, and every win was temporary salvation. One night, Vex invited Paul to drive, not just ride. The invitation felt like initiation, a test he wasn't sure he deserved to take. They drove out of the city, down empty roads that sliced through the sleeping suburbs. The streetlights disappeared one by one until only the moonlight guided them. Vex leaned back in the passenger seat, watching Paul as he gripped the wheel, his knuckles pale under the pressure. "Don't think," Vex said softly. "The car knows more than you do. You just have to trust it." Paul pressed the pedal, and the world began to blur again. The hum of the engine became something alive, almost sentient, a creature breathing beneath him. His heartbeat synced with the rhythm of the road, and for a fleeting moment, he felt what Vex had always been chasing. That illusion of control amidst chaos, the thin line between life and oblivion. When he finally slowed down, Vex looked at him, a faint smile crossing his otherwise stoic face. "Now you get it," he said. "You don't race for the crowd. You race for the silence that comes right before the crash." From that night, everything shifted. Paul began to notice how differently he carried himself on set. The confidence wasn't acted anymore. It was real. His movements behind the wheel, the way his eyes darted to the rearview mirror, the stillness in his voice when talking about loyalty and loss. They all came from something deeper. He wasn't playing Brian O'Connor. He was remembering him, or rather, remembering Vex, the man who had unknowingly become the spirit of that role. Yet, with that truth came a quiet dread, because Paul knew something that no one else did. Men like Vex didn't last long. They weren't built for peace or permanence. Their lives were like matches, brilliant, blinding, and brief. The deeper Paul went into that world, the more he saw how it consumed people. The smell of burnt rubber lingered in his hair for days, and the late-night echoes of revving engines haunted his dreams. He started wondering if he was still visiting their world, or if he had become part of it. There was one night when the illusion shattered. Vex showed up later than usual, his face drawn, his hands trembling in a way Paul had never seen before. He didn't say what happened, but Paul could tell something was wrong. They drove anyway. They always did. But the silence this time was different. It was thick, suffocating. Halfway down an empty stretch of road, Vex said quietly, "There's a moment, right before everything ends, when you can feel the world holding its breath. I've been chasing that moment my whole life, and I think tonight, I might finally catch it." Paul didn't understand until Vex hit the gas harder than he ever had. The tires screamed. The city vanished behind them. Paul shouted for him to stop, but Vex was somewhere else, lost in a memory only he could see. The car didn't crash that night, not physically, but something broke inside both of them. Paul realized then that some men weren't racing to live. They were racing because it was the only way they knew how to die slowly. After that, Vex disappeared. No messages, no calls. The underground whispered that he'd gone too far, that one night the road finally took him. Paul tried not to believe it, but deep down, he knew. The myth always ends the same way. In silence, under the hum of a cooling engine. Still, Vex's ghost lingered in everything Paul did. When he got the script for The Fast and the Furious, it felt like destiny playing one last trick. Every line about loyalty, every look of conflict, every chase through the neon-lit streets, it all came from that hidden world he once stepped into. Vex wasn't gone. He was immortal now, woven into a story that millions would watch without ever knowing it was real. And maybe that's what haunted Paul most. That the role that made him famous was born from a man the world never knew. A man who lived and died in the spaces between red lights and sirens. Sometimes, late at night, Paul would drive alone with no destination. The radio silent, his thoughts louder than the engine. He said it made him feel close to something honest again, something that fame could never touch. Maybe he was chasing the same silence Vex once talked about. If you're feeling the pull of this story, if you sense that strange tension between light and darkness, between the legend and the man, stay with me. Because what came next would blur the line between movie and reality in ways Paul could never have imagined. By the time The Fast and the Furious hit theaters, Paul Walker was no longer just an actor. He was a symbol, the clean-cut face of rebellion, the man who made speed feel sacred. Crowds cheered for the cars, the chaos, the explosions, but behind every scene of burning rubber and flashing lights, Paul carried something the cameras couldn't capture. The ghost of Vex lingered in every glance he threw across the driver's seat, in every quiet moment when the world slowed down and the silence pressed in. The world saw a Hollywood star, but Paul knew the truth. He was channeling a man who had lived and died in the shadows, whose story had never been told, whose spirit burned through every frame of film. As the franchise grew, so did the weight of that secret. Paul began noticing how the line between himself and the role of Brian O'Connor had started to dissolve. Journalists asked how he prepared for the part, and he would smile, say something vague about understanding the culture or learning from real racers. But deep down, he knew he was carrying Vex inside him like a heartbeat that refused to fade. When he drove, it wasn't acting anymore. It was remembering. Every drift, every near miss, every rush of air against his face. It was a conversation with a ghost. But the higher Paul rose, the more the air thinned. Fame, he discovered, wasn't freedom. It was confinement painted in gold. The studios wanted him to smile, to sell the fantasy of fast cars and brotherhood. But Paul knew that behind every race there was loss, a truth too heavy for Hollywood to carry. He thought often about how Vex used to say that the road was honest, that it revealed who you really were, and he began to wonder if fame had stolen that honesty from him. The irony was cruel. The role inspired by a man who rejected everything fake had made Paul a global icon in the most artificial industry in the world. During filming breaks, Paul would sometimes disappear. No entourage, no camera crew, no attention. He would drive out of the city, down long stretches of empty highway where the only light came from the dashboard and the stars. There, he found peace, or maybe something closer to surrender. The engine's hum reminded him of conversations long gone, of that night under the overpass, of Vex's warning that truth always demanded a price. He didn't race anymore, not really, but each drive felt like a quiet act of remembrance. Sometimes he swore he could almost see another car in the rearview mirror, the same matte black machine from years ago, keeping pace just behind him, like a shadow that refused to be left behind. The transformation didn't go unnoticed. Friends said Paul had changed, not in a bad way, but in a deeper one. He spoke differently. He looked at life differently. He was quieter, more reflective, more drawn to the simplicity of things that didn't demand applause. He became involved in humanitarian work, spending time helping people in disaster zones, building homes, rescuing wildlife. To outsiders, it looked like humility, but to Paul, it was penance, a way to balance the weight of what he carried, to make peace with the ghost that still followed him. Because Vex's story hadn't ended on that road. It lived inside him, whispering through the years like the low growl of an idling engine. Yet the more he tried to outrun that memory, the more fate seemed to circle back toward it. In interviews, when asked about his love for speed, he would smile and say, "I'm a car guy, always have been." But there was something in his eyes that betrayed a quiet ache, a flicker of fear mixed with acceptance. Because Paul knew what Vex had known. Speed isn't just motion, it's revelation. It strips away pretense until only truth remains. And truth, if faced too long, can destroy. It was on a quiet afternoon between shoots when the feeling returned. That strange pull in his chest, that old whisper from the past. A friend had invited him to a charity event, a simple drive, nothing dangerous. But the second Paul saw the car, sleek, red, alive in a way metal shouldn't be, something in him shifted. He ran his hand along the body, feeling the pulse of power beneath the hood, and in a flash, he was back under that overpass, standing next to Vex, hearing him say, You don't drive to escape. You drive because it's the only place where the truth doesn't hurt. The words echoed like a prophecy. As he settled into the passenger seat that day, Paul felt that familiar calm, that same silence before the storm. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe it was fate. But deep down, he sensed that the road ahead wasn't just asphalt. It was memory, waiting to close its loop. The driver beside him, a friend, revved the engine, smiling, unaware of the ghosts sitting in the back seat of their shared past. The car pulled away, the tires gripping the road like the beginning of a prayer. If there's one thing about life that Paul had learned from Vex, it was that destiny doesn't arrive with warning lights. It comes quiet, almost gentle, disguised as moments you think are harmless. The wind rushing through the window, the laughter before the turn, the reflection of the sky on the windshield. And then, all at once, the silence. The kind Vex once described. That moment when the world holds its breath. That silence would soon echo louder than any engine roar. The world would wake up one day to the news that Paul Walker, the man who embodied speed, loyalty, and brotherhood, was gone. The irony was merciless, but the truth was hauntingly poetic. The road that had given him purpose had taken him back, completing a circle that started with a ride he was never meant to take. The story that began with Vex would end the same way, in motion, in fire, in silence. But before that ending arrived, there was something sacred in the way Paul lived those last years. He wasn't running anymore. He wasn't chasing the next thrill. He had made peace with the inevitability of the road. Friends said he looked lighter, calmer, as if he had finally stopped fighting whatever haunted him. And maybe that's because he had accepted it. Accepted that Vex's ghost wasn't a curse, but a guide. A reminder that every life, no matter how brief, can burn bright enough to leave a mark on eternity. It's strange to think how fiction and reality intertwined so tightly that no one could tell where one ended and the other began. When fans watch Fast and Furious, they see a character, a cop turned racer, a hero torn between two worlds. But behind that performance was something far more real. A man shaped by an encounter no one else ever witnessed. Vex had been his mirror, showing him what happens when you live for the edge. Paul chose to understand it instead of succumb to it, and in doing so, he immortalized not just himself, but the man who inspired it all. Stories like these remind us that truth often hides behind legends, that even the brightest lights carry shadows, and that somewhere out there, on some forgotten stretch of asphalt, two souls who once crossed paths in the dark may still be racing, together, chasing that final moment of silence. If you feel this story deserves to live beyond the screen, if you want to keep uncovering the untold truths behind the faces you thought you knew, then subscribe. Stay with us, because what happens next will reveal the final, haunting connection between Paul Walker, the man, and the myth that never died. The world froze the day Paul Walker's name became a headline. It was one of those moments that felt impossible, a sudden tear in the fabric of what people believed about heroes. Fans refused to accept it at first, not because they didn't believe in death, but because they couldn't reconcile the image of Paul, the man who lived for motion, being gone in stillness. To them, he wasn't supposed to die that way. He was supposed to keep driving, somewhere beyond the horizon, eternal in that glowing twilight between sky and streetlight. But death, like destiny, doesn't ask permission. It arrives quietly, in the blink of an eye, and it takes with it not just a life, but the silence that follows after. News cameras swarmed the crash site. Reporters spoke in rehearsed tones, repeating details that blurred together. The speed, the car, the fire, the disbelief. But what they could never capture was the strange poetry of it all. The world saw tragedy, yet those who had known Paul saw something deeper. A man who had always lived between two worlds had finally crossed to the one he'd been chasing all along. There was a cruel beauty in that, something almost spiritual, as if the universe had written a full circle without asking for approval. He had become what he had once witnessed, a legend who met the end not in despair, but in motion, just as Vex had before him. In the days that followed, the people who had worked beside Paul spoke of him not like a celebrity, but like a force of nature. They said he laughed easily, gave quietly, and never carried the arrogance fame tends to carve into people. But beneath that warmth, he had always carried something heavier, a distance, a quiet melancholy that no one could name. It wasn't sadness exactly, it was awareness. The understanding that everything beautiful has an expiration date, and that speed, in all its glory, is only the illusion of outrunning time. Those close to him remembered how he often said he felt most alive when driving. Maybe what he meant was that he felt closest to truth, the same truth Vex had lived by. The road didn't lie. It stripped away everything that wasn't real. There were rumors among the underground racers, whispers that surfaced after his passing. Some said Paul had been searching for someone in those final months, asking questions about an old name, a ghost from years before. Others claimed he'd visited a long-abandoned lot, one that once hosted the kind of races nobody talked about publicly. A place where a matte black car used to wait, engine idling like a restless soul. Whether those stories were real or not didn't matter. What mattered was the feeling they carried. The sense that Paul hadn't been running from something. He had been going back to it, completing a story only he understood. And that story didn't end with the crash. It lived on in the quiet moments that followed, in the millions of hearts that felt that inexplicable emptiness when they heard the news. There was something universally human in his death, the reminder that even those who seem untouchable are made of the same fragile pieces as everyone else. But unlike most, Paul had left behind something eternal, not just his movies or his fame, but the energy he carried, the authenticity he fought to protect in a world built on illusion. He didn't preach about it, he lived it. Every smile, every cause he supported, every mile he drove, it all came from that same place where Vex once stood, beneath the hum of an idling engine, whispering about truth. After his death, people revisited his old interviews, looking for meaning in his words. There was one that stood out, one that now felt prophetic. He had said, "If one day the speed kills me, don't cry, because I was smiling." It sounded simple then, another soundbite from a man defined by motion, but now it felt like a message, not of recklessness, but of acceptance. Paul wasn't celebrating danger, he was acknowledging destiny. He understood what few do, that life isn't about how long it lasts, but how deeply it's lived, and whether you have the courage to face the silence waiting at the end of the road. Some nights, fans still gather where he took his last ride. They leave candles, photos, and model cars. The street smells faintly of fuel and flowers. And when the wind moves just right, the sound of a distant engine echoes through the dark. Maybe it's imagination, or maybe, like all legends, some parts of him refuse to rest. You can almost picture it. Paul behind the wheel, the city lights stretching endlessly ahead, and in the seat beside him, a shadow with familiar eyes. Vex, the ghost of the underground, the man who taught him what it meant to be free. Together again, not racing toward death, but away from time itself. There's something almost sacred about how stories like theirs fold into each other, how one life becomes the echo of another. Paul took a fragment of a forgotten man and turned it into something the world would never forget. And in return, the world made him immortal. Not because of fame, not because of money, but because he lived his truth without apology. Every time a car engine roars in a dark street, every time someone chases that feeling of being infinite for just a second, a piece of Paul lives again. A piece of Vex too. Two souls merged into myth, forever moving, forever alive in motion. In the end, what remains isn't tragedy, it's resonance. The way his story continues to ripple through the people who felt it. The fans who still play his movies not just for entertainment, but to feel close to something real. The drivers who whisper his name before a race. The quiet believers who look at the stars and think of headlights disappearing into the night. The legend of Paul Walker isn't about cars. It's about connection. About how one man's truth can ignite something in millions, even long after the light goes out. And maybe that's what he wanted all along. Not immortality, not worship, but understanding. To be remembered not as a character or a celebrity, but as a human being who saw beauty in impermanence. A man who found peace in speed and truth in silence. A man who met his reflection on a dark street and turned that encounter into eternity. If you felt something tonight, a chill, a memory, a sense of wonder that lingers long after the screen fades, don't let it pass. Leave a comment. Tell me where in the world you're watching from. Hit like if this story touched something in you, and subscribe so you don't miss the next untold chapter waiting in the dark. Because somewhere out there, on a road that never ends, Paul Walker is still driving. And the silence between those engine roars is the sound of forever.